The Twilight Zone, a show that exploited the paranormal to hold a mirror up to society's darkest corners, is most remembered for its cosmic twists and cautionary stories. However, there was one particular story that went too far, even though Rod Serling typically received awards for his social commentary. Not only did it push the boundaries, but it also tore them apart, resulting in such a strong backlash that the episode was essentially removed from television for more than 50 years. This one chapter was handled like a crime scene, while the rest of the series became legendary. It was concealed from syndication, kept secret in a vault, and removed from marathons as if it had never happened. The critics weren't afraid of an alien or a monster. It was something much more dangerous and grounded. What precisely was this episode that appeared to be too dangerous to broadcast? What transpired in those 30 minutes that compelled the network to conceal it for 50 years? Come along as we go into every detail. The man who got past the censors. One name consistently comes to mind while considering the best television ever produced. The Zone of Twilight. On October 2, 1959, it made its radio debut. And for 5 years, it transported viewers to a realm as timeless as infinity and as expansive as space. Created by the renowned Rod Serling, this wasn't just another show. It was a weekly anthology of the unusual, the supernatural, and the horrific. Every episode was a single story, meaning you never knew if you were going to see a future city, a haunting attic, or a tranquil suburban street that was about to transform into a nightmare. But while the viewers adored the aliens and the twist endings, the real story behind the show started with a man who was tired of being told what to do. Rod Serling was a superstar writer who frequently got into arguments with network bosses before he became our guide through the fifth dimension. Back then, sponsors had unlimited influence over what aired. If a corporation sold lighters, you couldn't have a character use a match. In fact, if an automaker sponsored the program, they would insist on having its rival company's buildings removed from the background. This was a complete catastrophe for a serious writer like Serling who wished to discuss actual human issues. The breaking point occurred when Serling sought to write a story about a true-life tragedy involving racial injustice. The original message was entirely lost by the time the networks and sponsors finished it, since they had altered the characters and the location so drastically. That's when Serling realized something wonderful. If he wanted to talk about the darkness in the actual world, he had to hide it in a world that didn't exist. He figured out that censors didn't mind a story about prejudice or war if it was happening to a green-skinned alien on a different planet. This led to his 1957 pitch called The Time Element, a story about a man who travels back to 1941 to warn people about Pearl Harbor. When it finally aired, the network had to give Serling his own show because of the overwhelming response. Initially, they had put it in a vault. The Twilight Zone became his imaginative playground after that. In addition to being the head writer and executive producer, he was also the renowned narrator who appeared on screen to explain to us how and why his characters had become lost. The show has become a launching platform for some of the biggest talents in history. Actors including Robert Redford, William Shatner, Leonard Nimoy, and even a young Ron Howard appeared in these 30-minute moral riddles long before they were well known. They portrayed characters ensnared in the merciless indifference of fate, frequently meeting an unexpected conclusion that made them and the spectator re-evaluate who they were. By the time the series concluded in 1964, Serling had written almost 100 episodes addressing everything from greed and jealousy to the secrets of the human mind. He demonstrated that telling a compelling truth doesn't require a large budget or a realistic location. All you need is a compelling narrative and a journey into the liminal space between light and shadow. We're still searching for that signpost up ahead today. Because the Twilight Zone showed us that the most frightening monsters aren't hiding under the bed. They're the ones we carry inside ourselves. Rod Serling's life. You must return to Christmas Day in order to comprehend the guy behind the enigma. 1924. Although Rodman Edward Serling was raised in the sleepy town of Binghamton, where his father had a neighborhood grocery shop, he was born in Syracuse, New York. It was a regular, pleasant childhood. However, everything changed the moment he graduated from high school. Sorling volunteered in the army during World War II, inspired by a passionate ambition to help defeat the Nazis in Europe. But destiny had other ideas, and he ended up serving as a paratrooper in the Pacific. He had more than just a Purple Heart from the war. He suffered from severe mental wounds that never fully healed. At the Battle of Leyte, he witnessed the worst of humanity. And when he eventually returned home with wrist and knee ailments, he discovered another type of suffering. Shortly after his return, his father unexpectedly passed away from a heart attack. His creative fire was fueled by the twin blows of personal tragedy and military hardship. The shadows of his personal experiences gave rise to every ghost, monster, and shattered figure he would eventually write. Sorling relocated to Ohio to attend Antioch College following the war. Here, he met Carol, his future wife, and began the family that would serve as his pillar of support. He continued to be a loving father even as his business took off and he started working demanding 12-hour days, 7 days a week. Later on, his daughter revealed that she never felt the burden of his long workdays. He was merely a father figure to her, there for her whenever she wanted to talk. He was a man who kept his feet firmly planted in his family's affection while living in the twilight zone of his imagination. Unfortunately, the stress he carried and the unrelenting speed of his life finally caught up with him. Sorling had a heart attack while using a treadmill in May 1975, while he was only 50 years old. A few weeks later, he was unwinding at his lakefront cabin when he was attacked again. He was hurried into open cardiac surgery. However, on June 28, 1975, the man who had dedicated his life to studying the secrets of death and the human soul ultimately went behind closed doors. We are still troubled by the legacy he left behind. However, creating that legacy wasn't always easy. In actuality, the show that helped him become well known was a never-ending battlefield between the suits in command and his artistic vision. The networks attempted to destroy the 30-minute masterpiece. The show that we now refer to as a masterpiece wasn't always a hit, which may surprise most people. Despite receiving high praise from critics, The Twilight Zone found it difficult to gain traction with CBS's upper management. It may surprise you to learn that the show was cancelled twice. The first time was following the third season, primarily due to their inability to find a sponsor who would put their name on such bizarre tales. The fact that James Aubrey, a senior executive, allegedly couldn't stomach the series didn't help either. Fair Exchange, a comedy, took its place. However, the network crawled back to Sorling, pleading for more after that show failed so miserably. However, there was a catch to this comeback that nearly killed the show. The episodes were a terrific, punchy half-hour for the first 3 seasons. The network converted it into a full-hour format when it came back for season 4. For Sorling, this was a nightmare. Stretching those tight, complex narratives into 60 minutes made the stories feel thin, and he was already worn out from writing most of the series himself. By the time they returned to the half-hour format for season 5, the network had permanently discontinued the show since the magic had worn off and the audience had wandered away. The show's spirit was based on a very real, very tragic tragedy, even though it felt like pure imagination. Emmett Till, a 14-year-old black kid who was brutally murdered in Mississippi in 1955, left Rod Sorling profoundly troubled. Sorling was determined to turn the situation into a serious drama. However, the networks blocked him each time he attempted. The dispute scared them. The Twilight Zone exists precisely because of this discontent. Sorling came to the realization that he had to hide it if he wanted to discuss the ugly aspects of racism and hatred. He made the well-known statement that a writer must use their craft to critique society. And he eventually managed to show America its own reflection without the censors halting him by using monsters and aliens as a cover. Rod Sorling was a dark-suited, passionate, enigmatic character to the general public. However, the man his family knew was entirely different. Anne, his daughter, once said that everyone's black and white perception of him was completely untrue. In actuality, he was a legendary practical joker and a complete idiot. He was the partygoer who would put a lampshade on his head to make others laugh. Although it seems contradictory, it makes perfect sense. It's likely that a man who spent so much time gazing into the depths of human evil needed humor to maintain his sanity. He also has a big heart. Sorling felt the initial footage didn't do the story credit, so he paid out of pocket to reshoot the parts with a replacement actor when an actor called Paul Douglas passed away shortly after completing an episode. And there's that famous tune. You are familiar with those 4 eerie notes that let you know right away that you have entered a different realm. It's interesting to see that motif wasn't present initially. The genius behind the scores for Psycho and Vertigo, Bernard Herrmann, actually composed the original music. The network suits weren't happy, even though it was fantastic. In a desperate attempt to find something fresh, they even asked other renowned composers to try it. In actuality, their method of discovering the ideal sound was somewhat of a cunning business strategy. Lud Gluskin, the music director at CBS, looked for inexpensive music from Europe in order to cut costs and avoid union dues. He discovered some musical cues penned by Marius Constant, a struggling Romanian composer. Constant was given a pitiful $200 to compose something by the following day, plus a tiny bonus if they used it. It wasn't until months later that he realized his music was being used for one of the most well-known performances in history after turning in his work and getting paid. It was a Frankenstein theme that was pieced together from several musical compositions, but it became an enduring feature of popular culture. It wasn't until the 1980s that Constant received recognition for his contributions. He ultimately had to file a lawsuit in order to be acknowledged, demonstrating that the Twilight Zone was full of odd turns even behind the scenes. The show's path was as dramatic as the tales Sorling presented, from its modest, struggling beginnings to its position as a cultural titan. A man's battle against censorship, his personal suffering, and a small amount of unintentional musical brilliance came together in a perfect storm. Together, they created a world where the seemingly unattainable was always just a step away. Even though Sorling relied heavily on his own creativity, occasionally the most amazing ideas weren't created in a Hollywood office but rather found somewhere else. The team had to get inventive by the conclusion of the show. Not just with their ideas, but also with their money, which resulted in one of the most distinctive episodes in TV history. The short film that saved the zone was a $25,000 masterpiece. An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, an episode from Season 5, is a piece of television history that seems to have been taken from another world. This tale had already won the Oscar for Best Live-Action Short Film and won first place at the 1962 Cannes Film Festival long before it appeared on American television screens. How, then, could a French picture of such great caliber and prestige find its way into a monthly anthology of science fiction like The Twilight Zone? The solution is far more useful and far less magical. It all boiled down to cold, hard money. The show's producers were drowning by the time it reached its 5th season. They were attempting to cover the enormous order of 36 episodes with their dwindling resources. A single episode produced from scratch typically costs roughly $65,000. William Fu, the producer, saw that by merely purchasing the rights to screen this already existing short film for a pitiful $25,000, he could save a fortune. To suit the commercial breaks, it had to be somewhat edited. However, he couldn't resist the opportunity to save $40,000. However, the atmosphere was more important than the money. An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge doesn't appear to be your average Twilight Zone episode on paper. It is set in 1862 and relates the tale of a Confederate sympathizer who, in order to be with his family again, miraculously avoids his own execution. Its unsettling tone and the sense that something is fundamentally wrong made it fit well into Rod Serling's universe, even if there are no ironic genies or space travelers. One of the most eerie and unforgettable chapters in the series, it examined those shadowy, dusty areas of the human mind where hallucinations and reality collide. Naturally, discussing the show would be impossible without discussing the man. To us, Rod Serling. He is the main attraction. He was the voice that led us through the darkness each week, the pen that produced the majority of the scripts, and the brain that came up with the idea. Interestingly, though, Sorling was never supposed to be the narrator. He was solely recognized as a writer in the beginning. Cornelius Westbrook Van Voris was a professional voice actor that the producers truly desired. Because he narrated all of the dramatic news reels, this man was a legend in the 1940s and was known as the voice of doom. He was put to the test for the pilot, Where Is Everyone? However, it simply didn't click. His voice seemed arrogant and a little too stiff for a show about imagination because it was so deep and polished. The legendary Orson Welles was even taken into consideration, but the studio refused to pay him the enormous sum he demanded. In the end, Sorling simply volunteered and put his own hat in the ring. It proved to be the most astute decision in TV history. A humorous anecdote from the early recording sessions describes Sorling's constant discussion of the sixth dimension. He and the producers realized they couldn't even describe the fifth one, much less the sixth, so he had to alter it to the fifth. Sorling essentially became a god in the realm of the show once he solidified his position as host. He was both everywhere and nowhere, seeing the bizarre happenings, yet never doing anything to assist. However, his supernatural abilities extended beyond the screen. It also followed him in the background. Only Rod Sorling was permitted to use the term God in his scripts due to a strange, unofficial restriction at CBS. This used to greatly irritate the show's renowned writer, Richard Matt. The network censors would instantly cross out the word if he attempted to write it into his scripts. He assumed Sorling's reputation was so strong that the suits gave him a pass that no one else could receive, though he never really understood why. Reaching that degree of power required a great deal of trial and error. However, before the show was finally produced, Sorling had to compose 3 separate pilots. His first attempt, The Time Element, was a time travel narrative about Pearl Harbor that was initially rejected by the network and stored in a vault. It wasn't until another producer found it and made it a huge smash on a different show that it was produced. The network invited Sorling to do another pilot after that success. He submitted a script titled The Happy Place, which offered a horrifying glimpse into a future in which anyone over 60 would be put to death. Although they thought the writing was excellent, the producers felt it was too gloomy and dreary to start a new series. So Sorling returned to the typewriter. The third attempt proved to be successful. Where Is Everyone? Is what he came up with. A gripping mystery that, without the use of monsters or aliens, skillfully combined psychological horror and intrigue. It demonstrated that sometimes the most perilous place you may go is not another planet but rather the lonely universe inside your own imagination, setting the tone for everything that will follow. However, other program creators were occupied with a different kind of terror while Sorling was preoccupied studying the human psyche. There were moments when the drama on the set matched the intensity of the scripts. Additionally, the conflict didn't remain behind the scenes for one particular show. It erupted into a heated dispute that persisted for many years. A Nightmare at 20,000 Feet. The Personal Torment of Richard Donner. We all know George Takei from the Starship Enterprise bridge. But before he daringly ventured where no man had gone before, he was making his way through the Twilight Zone's even darker hallways. A teenage Takei portrayed a Japanese-American gardener who engages in a tense psychological confrontation with a World War II veteran in an episode titled The Encounter. The two men have a straightforward conversation at first, but while they speak, a cursed samurai sword works as a magical catalyst, removing their masks and exposing the hideous wounds from their pasts. It has a far more contentious history, while being regarded by many as one of the show's most profound comments about how war ruins the human soul. The outcry after its first broadcast was so intense and quick that CBS took an almost unprecedented action. After removing the program from the rotation, they secured it. The episode's portrayal of Japanese-American culture and history profoundly outraged Japanese-American advocacy groups, particularly with plot lines that felt like a smack in the face to those who had endured the anguish of internment. The interaction became a lost chapter as a result. Takei himself quipped in an interview that it was the only episode that never had a rerun, meaning he missed out on those lovely residual checks for decades. It wasn't until 2016, more than 50 years after it was first buried, that it eventually came to light during a New Year's Day marathon. Today, it serves as an intriguing, if unsettling, reminder of a period when the public found the show's social commentary to be too harsh. Speaking of secrets, there is some mystery around the origin of the show's renowned title. Rod Serling was never totally certain of the origin of the name, despite the fact that you would think the man who invented the fifth dimension would know. At first, he thought he had just invented the phrase, but later on, he recognized he might have been drawing on his own combat experience. As it happens, pilots in the Air Force actually used the odd term, Twilight Zone. It depicts the unsettling moment when the pilot can no longer see the horizon as the plane approaches. A situation where one is literally torn between two universes. It's very probable that the phrase was just lingering in the back of Serling's mind, waiting for the ideal opportunity to come to the surface, given that he had served in the military before ever using a typewriter. However, the expression was not limited to the Air Force. The phrase was first used by philosophers in 1946 to characterize that creative liminal space where science and art converge. The fact that a name so closely associated with the unknown has such an elusive past is almost poetic. Long before Serling used it to transform television, the phrase was in the background. Even though the name might have come naturally, filming some of the most well-known episodes was a complete disaster. Consider Nightmare at 20,000 feet. Everyone remembers this one. William Shatner, a former star of Trek, plays the famous tale of a guy on a flight who witnesses a strange creature tearing off the engine on the plane's wing. It's a masterclass in suspense on screen. Director Richard Donner, however, was going through his own personal hell behind the scenes. Nothing could have prepared Donner for the insanity of that set, even though he would go on to direct huge hits like Superman and Lethal Weapon. For the time, the technical requirements were astounding. To create the appearance of a storm at great altitude, they had to arrange a guy flying in on wires, enormous wind turbines, artificial rain, lightning, and smoke. The actors were unable to hear the director's directions, let alone their own voices, due to the overwhelming cacophony produced by the machinery. They were struggling against the clock every second, according to Donner, who subsequently described the situation as intolerable. The entire take was wrecked if one smoke machine jammed or one wire broke. Everyone was pushed to their utmost in this high-stakes, high-stress situation. The tremendous anxiety they caught in that small cockpit became one of the most memorable moments in pop culture history, despite the silly-looking creature suit that fans still make fun of. It's a prime illustration of how, in Rod Serling's world, the pursuit of the seemingly impossible frequently produced something genuinely timeless. However, one particular scenario ignited a public conflict that lasted for 50 years, even if the most of the show's conflicts were fought against wind machines and limited funding. This episode went too far, even for a show that enjoyed pushing buttons, and it resulted in a decades-long blackout that no one anticipated. Why? The interaction disappeared. One episode of The Twilight Zone struck out for all the wrong reasons, despite the show's reputation for unsettling turns. An episode called The Encounter became a ghost in the history of the show, despite the fact that masterpieces like The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street are still highly regarded today. Removed from the air for an incredible 52 years. The blackout was not the result of an alien or a monster. The American audience found the story to be way too sensitive. Two men are imprisoned in a messy attic by the plot. Fenton, a tired World War II veteran, and Arthur Takamori, portrayed by a young George Takei, who appears in search of employment. What begins as a straightforward discussion soon becomes poisonous. A samurai sword that Fenton grabbed from a soldier he murdered is positioned in the middle of the space. According to the myth, the blade possesses magical malice and acts as a pressure cooker, forcing both men to face their most severe wartime traumas. However, the violence wasn't the true reason it was outlawed. The message was what it was. Arthur's father may have been a traitor during the Pearl Harbor attacks, according to the episode. In addition to being historically incorrect, this was deeply disrespectful to the Japanese-American community that had endured the horrors of internment camps. The timing couldn't have been worse, coming out right before the United States entered the Vietnam War. The program was essentially buried by CBS, and it wasn't shown again until a 2016 New Year's Day marathon. Unfortunately, this wasn't the only cloud hanging over the franchise. The Twilight Zone was released in 1982, years after. One of the saddest disasters in Hollywood occurred at the location of the film. Actor Vic Mororo and two young actors perished in a helicopter crash on site. A catastrophe so terrible that it permanently altered cinema safety regulations. It serves as a reminder that even the most progressive shows have their limits. TV history is replete with instances where the distinction between bold and problematic is blurred, from Seinfeld withdrawing the Puerto Rican Day episode to The Simpsons burying their New York City special after September 11. The encounter continues to serve as a chilling reminder that the real-world repercussions in the zone are frequently more terrifying than the fictional ones.